Well, firstly, thank you to Jane and thank you to Anne for inviting me along to speak with you all tonight. It's been a long relationship with Aussie Deaf Kids over the years, particularly Anne Porter. We go way back, so it's a pleasure to be here with Aussie Deaf Kids speaking to you about sport and sport inclusion. So we've got an hour together. I'm hoping I can get through everything in a nice way that's digestible for you all and not too overwhelming. So we'll be talking a little bit tonight about who I am, who Deaf Sports Australia is, the history of deaf sports, and a little bit as well about the opportunities and pathways for deaf and hard of hearing children to be involved in sports. I'll also be talking about the various classifications and the eligibility rules around deaf sports and what that all means. And also in terms of sport participation, what modifications or support options are available to allow deaf and hard of hearing children to be involved in sport. And then we've got time for question and answer at the end, which I'm looking forward to. So a little bit about who I am. So I've been deaf from birth, and I won't tell you my age, but I think you can probably make some guesses based on my appearance, possibly. But my hearing loss is I've got no hearing aid in my right ear. I'm profoundly deaf. In my left ear, it's at the severe to profound level of hearing loss. And I wear a hearing aid in my left ear, which I've worn since I was 3 years old. I used to have the big FM device, which I wore until I was 18, which was quite a large device we had to wear on our chest. My hearing loss has been consistent throughout my life. It hasn't fluctuated at all. In terms of school, in the early days, was a bit like a guinea pig, I felt, in terms of at that time in era, there were some schools that used sign language and there were schools that were more of an oral method of teaching. And at that time as well, they tried to see how it would go with deaf children just in general mainstream schools. And I was one of those guinea pigs, one of the first ones that went through that mainstream setting. I finished school in year 12. I didn't necessarily succeed. I tried the next year again and I failed again. And the reason why I failed was my English. My English was not the same as my peers. And I then pursued my professional career. I went back to school at the age of 25. I did my year 12 again and I passed at that point. And my life has then gone on a journey since then. And in terms of my social life growing up, I thought that might be an important element to share about myself. I did find it difficult growing up, being with hearing children, all talking. I loved sport. I loved being active. I loved being a part of those activities where communication really wasn't necessary. I was good with one-on-one type of conversations, or good people that I was familiar with, I could communicate. But if we were in large groups, I found that quite difficult, it being a mainstream setting and me being the only deaf child. As I got older, it was interesting actually. My school was a boys' school that I attended, which, when it came to talking to girls, at the age of 16 and 17 and 18, I was very shy and awkward. I didn't know how to properly communicate. It took me a long time to develop those particular skills, but had a couple of girlfriends and a few actual friends that were girls, built my confidence, and mixing with deaf people at that point in my life as well helped me a lot in terms of building that confidence. And my working and voluntary life, touching on that, my first job was in the public service in transport. I then went to university and got my youth work degree, and I became a youth worker at the Deaf Society here in Melbourne, in Victoria. I worked there for many years, and I did a few different roles and finished working in the technology space when it comes to access for deaf and hard of hearing people. We know of one organisation you might be familiar with. They're now called Deaf Victoria. I worked there for many years as well. In early 2000s, I did my research PhD at university, and my PhD thesis was on technology and technology access in the workplace, and particularly VRI, so video relay interpreting. At that time, America had that technology. It wasn't available here in Australia. So my PhD was looking at those services and proving the fact that it could work here in Australia. And that would then enable deaf and hard of hearing people to have further access by accessing interpreters remotely, and allowing them to be more confident in the workplace and progress in their career. So in terms of my sporting life, as I said before, I loved sports. I still do now. I still actively play sports now, but that's an important part of who I am. My family and community, I married, I have 4 kids. I married a deaf woman, and all our kids are now adults, and we have a lovely family. And in terms of the last thing about me, other interests, I love reading, I love walking, I love keeping active and socializing with the community. Okay, so who is Deaf Sports Australia? So it's a national organisation and has been in existence since 1954. The history of deaf sports goes well beyond that, but in terms of deaf sports, deaf clubs, that's been in existence for over 70 years now. And the purpose of Deaf Sports Australia really is to support deaf and hard of hearing people participate and be involved in sporting activities and physical exercise, physical activities like recreational type activities. As we know, there are many barriers when it comes to accessing sport, and being involved at those national, international and more elite levels. Deaf Sports Australia provides support and advocacy and information sharing amongst the deaf and hard of hearing community about these opportunities. We also work with national sporting organisations such as cricket, athletics, swimming and tennis, and we work with them to make sure their sports are accessible for deaf and hard of hearing people. So a lot of advocacy, a lot of awareness, and a lot of training that we provide to those peak sporting organisations. Deaf Sports Australia has members across the country. One of those members is a national deaf sports organisation. So we have 16 different sports that are members of us. We have state deaf sports organisations, and we have 6. So that's like New South Wales, Deaf Sports, Queensland and Victoria. And then we also have local sporting clubs that are members of us, such as the Melbourne Basketball Club and other sporting clubs. And similar with the Olympics and the Paralympics, we have international group called the ISCD, the International Sports Committee for the Deaf, and they organise the Deaf Olympics. But in terms of managing World Championships and managing the Australian team going to those events, Deaf Sports Australia plays a big part. And deaf and hard of hearing people participate in local sporting clubs, in state competitions, national competitions and international competitions. And I'll talk more a bit about that later on in the presentation, but Deaf Sports Australia plays a big role in that. So just a little bit of background now, and a bit of a timeline and the history of deaf sports here in Australia. When Australia was colonised, we know sports came to Australia and it developed its own identity around sports. But the first deaf sporting team was established in 1880 in Melbourne, and it is one of the oldest around the world, the oldest deaf sporting clubs, and it's still in existence to this day, the Melbourne Deaf Cricket Club. And through sports, sports is a big part of the community as well. the deaf community, an opportunity to meet other deaf people, whether it's to socialize or catch up. But through sports, we see the deaf community coming together and people coming together. And for different reasons, people get together, but a lot of deaf societies and deaf organizations support the sporting industry and sports by organizing carnivals, because they know how important sport is to deaf and hard of hearing people. And then we had the first Australian Deaf Games, which was in Sydney in 1964. Recently, the Games should have been held in 2022 this year in Newcastle, but unfortunately, due to COVID, that put a spanner in the works. So it's been postponed to 2024 in Newcastle with the next Australian Deaf Games. So 60 years of the Australian Deaf Games. So that's a significant piece to celebrate. Most of the games are usually competed over 10 days with multiple different sports. In 2018, the Australian Deaf Games, there was almost 2,000 people that attended the games and participated in the games. And people of all levels of hearing loss, different ages, kids from the ages of 13, 14, all the way up to the ages of 70, 80 involved. It's very, very popular. On an international level, every 4 years, as is the Olympics, is the Deaf Olympics, which first started in 1924 and has been running every time since then. In Melbourne hosted the Deaf Olympics in 2005, and was most recently in Brazil, which was quite difficult due to COVID. The number of countries that were attending was reduced. They still decided to hold the Deaf Olympics and go ahead with the games this year. So I briefly talked about Deaf Sports Australia, but I do want to talk a little bit more about who we are and the different aspects of our work and what we actually do and how you can get involved. So we support and advocate on behalf of deaf athletes, deaf people, and programs that support this. We have 7 staff. Our general manager is full-time. We have a sports development officer who's based in Queensland, similar role in New South Wales, and a similar role in Victoria, and quite soon to establish a role in Western Australia. And we have a person who looks after the Australian Deaf Games, or who's responsible for the Australian Deaf Games. We have 2 new funded projects, national projects, funded by Sports Australia. And we have one role or one focus, which is on the AFL and AFL participation. So encouraging more young deaf, hard of hearing children to be involved in AFL. And a partnership, now we have a very successful and healthy partnership with the AFL, and thinking about areas such as Auskick, how that can be improved to be more accessible, the provision of deaf awareness training to the AFL community, and also establishing a deaf AFL football competition as a part of this grant we've received from AFL. So the AFL have wheelchair football, they have blind football, and they have intellectual disability football, but yet to have deaf football. So this project that's been funded by them is to work out how we can establish something for deaf and hard of hearing people. So it's very exciting. So hopefully we'll see what will be learnt here can then also be adapted and rolled out into other sports. So we're hoping sports such as swimming, tennis, cricket will adopt a similar model in how they can establish sports for deaf and hard of hearing athletes. One program that I think would really interest many of you, whether you're a parent or a teacher, is the sports school program, which is federally, which is funded by the federal government, and all schools around Australia can offer sports programs, as you would all know. So it's working with their national sports organisations to deliver that. So Deaf Sports Australia is considered a national sports organisation specifically for deaf people. So schools that have deaf children can ask for funding, and they can run sports activities, they can run clinics or whatever it might be they want to do, but they can partner with Deaf Sports Australia to attend the school, run the programs in schools. So it's just an application process that the school will go through each term to access this funding, and we can then come into the school and run some accessible school activities and accessible sport programs for all kids at the school. That started 2 years ago, but again, due to COVID, there were some impacts. So we started running that again at the end of last year. So we'll be running some activities in schools since then, a couple in Queensland, some in New South Wales and Victoria, and soon to be in South Australia. So it's slowly getting more and more popular, which is fantastic. So staff, I was going into detail about there. So we've got the sports development officers that work with the schools and work with the sporting organisations to offer lots of different activities like sporting days, as well as other specific sports events, so futsal or athletics days for deaf and hard of hearing children. Next month in Victoria, for example, we're organising in partnership with all the schools there a multi-sports day. So all secondary schools, all the deaf and hard of hearing kids from across Victoria come together in one place and compete in different sports, opportunity for them to socialise, meet other deaf children in other schools. And we're doing one with the primary schools and primary students later on in the year. So that's becoming very, very popular as well. We also provide deaf awareness training, as I mentioned before. Some sports organisations or sporting clubs might have a deaf or hard of hearing kid there, or a deaf or hard of hearing adult in their club, and they might be unsure how they can make it accessible. So that's something we can absolutely provide assistance with. We can provide awareness training, we can provide resources, a whole range of different things to help clubs and sports be more accessible for deaf and hard of hearing kids and adults. And it's becoming a lot more popular, those awareness training sessions. Support, a lot of sporting activities and a lot of sports do really want to make themselves more inclusive. Not only for deaf people, but for those that might be blind or other physical disabilities. And we're seeing that momentum really shift. And there are a lot of people that are motivated to want to make change, and they can work with us to develop programs, or we can help assess their particular deliverables or what they offer, and provide some advice about how they can make things more accessible, whether it's communication or whether it's certain modifications they can make to make it more accessible. If it's their building, such as lights or sound, or how different things within the whole place can be more accessible. And we provide that expertise and advice. I mentioned before about our national deaf sporting organisations. They also run their own national sport championships as well. So we support them to have their various events that might be held on a weekend, say for example for golf, the Australian Deaf Golf Championships or Australian Deaf Netball Championships, various tournaments that are held throughout the year run by these deaf sporting organisations. And we're responsible at Deaf Sports Australia for organising the Australian Deaf Games. And that includes locating a venue, arranging sponsorship, establishing registration systems, providing opportunities for the various sports, working with the community to get people along, and the social activities that happen around those sporting competitions, such as theatre and a whole range of different things. We have thousands of people attending these events. So there's lots of work that naturally goes in, usually 2-3 years prior to the event, just organising, but they're very enjoyable. The next one, 2024, as I mentioned, will be in Newcastle, so that'll be in January, in Lake Macquarie. So anyone who's at 13 or 14 or older can participate in the Australian Deaf Games. And there is one of the rules in terms of hearing loss, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later, which might be a question asked as well. What level of hearing loss allows you to participate in the Australian Deaf Games? Then we've got, on that international level, there are a variety of different competitions, such as this Asian Pacific World Games, the actual World Games, the Deaf Olympics. There's lots of opportunities for deaf people to participate internationally. I thought I'd just share a few photos over the years of different activities and sports that deaf people have competed in. On the top left corner, that's in 1910, which was the cricket team, which actually is connected to the middle one, which is another cricket team in 2004. So that team is still playing to this day. And there's a variety of different sports and competitions. We've got chess, we've got netball, we've got swimming, we've got football, rugby union, rugby league. And some of these photos also include working with schools. So going and visiting such as the Northern Territory, Tasmania, working with schools to teach them about how they can make sports more inclusive, and running camps as well as a part of that. As I mentioned before, it doesn't matter how old you are, whether you're young or old. For example, 10-pin bowling. There's a lady there that's at the age of 84, still competing in the 10-pin bowling competition, and at the most recent Australian Deaf Games, she got a silver medal. So well done to her. I mentioned before about pathways. I've touched on that. So when we're talking about deaf sports, if someone's interested in competing, deaf or hard of hearing person, you've obviously got your local sporting clubs naturally, and you've got your national deaf championships, which is then the Australian Deaf Games, and you can see how it progresses into more international events, such as mainstream pathway. It's very similar. There is a specific pathway for deaf sports. So this is the mainstream sports now on the slide. So if you compete in mainstream sports, it's very similar. You've got your local level, you've got little athletics, Auskick, and others, and school programs. You've got your local events, state and national championships, international. So deaf and hard of hearing kids can compete in those within those sporting streams as well. And some sports have, whether they're national or state championships, they have the multi-class events. And those multi-class events are usually under the Paralympic classifications, but it also does include deaf and hard of hearing and other disabilities within that. So swimming, athletics, and netball is a great promotion about including multi-class events within their competitions and championships. The Paralympics, for some people that may not be aware, some deaf people that have additional disabilities do compete at the Paralympics, particularly those that might be deaf and have a vision impairment. Vision impairment is their primary disability, and deafness is then considered their secondary disability. So that's why they can compete in the Paralympics. But if you're deaf, you can't compete in the Paralympics, which is why there's the Deaf Olympics. So in terms of the eligibility rules and the classifications, and this is the similar rules globally. in the Paralympics have their particular classification and eligibility rules around certain levels of vision loss, different degrees of amputation, different levels of cognitive disability. Similarly, with deaf and hard of hearing sports, there are these classifications and eligibility rules around participating at that international level, as well as the domestic Australian level. Similarly, for multi-class, it says you have to have a 55 decibel or more in your better ear. So your audiology report obviously will show what that average is and whether that's 55 or less. And that supports knowledge of whether or not you can participate, and you have to have that proof to be eligible and provide that proof rather. The Australian Deaf Games and the National Deaf Games is a little bit more broader. So that's at 40 to 54 decibel. So 40 to profoundly deaf essentially, but 40 decibel, yeah, usually you might still be able to hear, of course, but yes, that's at the 40 to 54. And then 0 to 39 level, unfortunately, you're not eligible to participate in those events, but we do work with sporting organisations to really encourage them to still include deaf and hard of hearing people that might be at that level to ensure they can still participate. Okay, so I wanted to touch on now touch on sport modifications and support options. We get a lot of questions about how sports can be more accessible to deaf and hard of hearing people, and then being able to participate on an equal level to people they're competing with. So there are lots of options. I've got some here to share. So for sports such as football or swimming at those local competitions, rather than having a starter's gun, they can have a flag. That tends to work for deaf sports people. And also a buddy system, someone that can tap you and making sure you're aware of what's happening, particularly young children. That really helps. The buddy system that someone can cue them into announcements or when things are about to start. There are also lighting systems, which you see often used in athletics and swimming. And the national and international championships for mainstream sports, there are lights. Many swimming centres have those built in. Some Australian athletes utilise those, but there are different types of lighting systems that are cued into the starter's gun, which are connected to the starter's gun by a wire. And that photo that you can see on the slide there is an example of those lighting systems. So it's ready, set, go. And the lights illuminate at those certain points, green, amber, and red, similar to athletics. Rather than the athlete having to look around to see the gun actually go off, they can just concentrate on what they need to do. And there's a light right there in front of them, and they're off the starter's block as the same time as everybody else. There are also customized or adjustable sporting headgears. So you might use that for football or rugby, those contact sports. We do often get asked about how you can wear a helmet with a hearing aid or a cochlear implant. Most people do remove those devices, but especially at those younger years, there are particular sporting headgears you can get that enable you to still wear your devices. It might be also wearing a hat that really helps keeping it on your head. It works really well, but there are particular headgears that you can get. I know of a person who has an implant that plays AFL in the seconds, and he wears a particular headset that works really well for him, where his implant can stay on. Other supporting options might be Olsign interpreters. Sometimes sporting clubs, in terms of them being accessible, might be an interpreter that's on a voluntary basis, or a parent or a family member, or a deaf person even attending and helping make sure communication is accessible. But now with the National Disability Insurance Scheme funding, that helps greatly in being able to access interpreters, which obviously links to that next point there about NDIS funding. So if it's included in your plan, like health and wellbeing elements or goals, reducing isolation, improving mental health, wanting to be a part of your local sporting clubs or sports in general, you can have additional funding to make sure those sports are then inclusive. So that might be modifications, having access to interpreters, having a support person even attend. The NDIS does accept those aspects of support and fund those aspects of support. Many state sporting organisations now have established what they call sports voucher program at that state level. So again, you can apply for that. It's free. It's about $150 or $200 of value, and that might cover the cost of participation in sports. And that can also be used for interpreters. So you negotiate with the clubs in terms of what their sporting program is and what that voucher can be used for, those sporting vouchers. And the next one I talked about before, but the provision of deaf sports awareness training, and Deaf Sports Australia does that. We offer that so we can help clubs and organisations be more aware, so we can provide that awareness training. So that was a bit of a whirlwind, I realise. I tried to keep it fairly short to enable us time for questions and answers. So now's an opportunity for us to have some conversations, and happy to answer any of your questions.